Meg woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. However, a few intruders had already snuck into her house, just as Meg was about to turn off the lights and go back to sleep. She saw 3 unfamiliar men appear on the surveillance camera. Meg was instantly shocked and terrified. She had no idea what would happen next, but a woman's intuition told her that if she wanted to survive, she had to act fast. There was no time to think. In a panic, she ran to her daughter Sarah's room. She hurriedly grabbed a cup of warm water to wake up Sarah, and told Sarah not to speak loudly. She quickly pulled her daughter and ran outside, but just as they were about to head downstairs, in a moment of desperation, Meg yanked open the elevator door. Then, they hurriedly hid inside as fast as they could. Just as they felt a sense of relief, they were shocked to find Junior waiting for them downstairs. The elevator suddenly shot up again, and they narrowly escaped danger. The thieves were instantly furious, jumping in rage, taking advantage of the brief moment when the thieves were catching up. Meg swiftly pulled Sarah out of the elevator and fled. At this moment, she knew that the only chance for them to survive was to hide in the impenetrable safe room. Luckily, they managed to get into the safe room before the thieves could catch up. The crazed thieves relentlessly banged on the door. Venting their fury, Meg and Sarah huddled in the corner, terrified. At this point, Meg noticed the phone in the room, but when she tried to call the police, she discovered the phone line had been cut. Then, Sarah noticed a broadcast button next to the phone. She suggested her mother use the broadcast to tell the thieves that they had already called the police. They hoped this would scare them off. However, to their surprise, the thieves didn't believe it. Instead, they told Meg that there was no phone in the safe room. Meg was puzzled how they knew that. The thieves then pulled out a note. It indicated that the item they wanted was in the safe room. They promised to let the 2 of them go if they came out. It turned out that these thieves were the house's previous contractors. It was clear they were after the safe in the safe room, but no matter how the thieves threatened or bribed them, Meg refused to come out, even if it meant dying. Enraged and embarrassed, the thieves decided to get more aggressive. They proceeded to seal all the windows in the room. Seeing what the thieves were doing, they knew the thieves would never leave easily. Mother and daughter fell into deep despair once again. However, just as they were at a loss, a sudden vibration from the floor caught their attention. It turned out the thieves were trying to break into the safe room from below. But what they never expected was that there was a thick steel plate beneath the safe room. At this moment, Meg suddenly heard a noise coming from the wall. It turned out that the loud noise had caused the neighbors to complain. Seeing this, the mother and daughter felt like they had found a lifeline. They quickly began desperately banging on the walls and shouting for help. But due to the thick walls, their cries for help couldn't penetrate the heavy barriers. However, the thieves didn't plan to give up so easily. Burnham started smashing a hole in the wall. It turned out they planned to use the gas to force the mother and daughter out through the ventilation pipes. Watching the thieves' strange actions on the surveillance, Meg instantly realized that something was terribly wrong. Just then, she suddenly smelled something unusual. Meg immediately signaled to Sarah to lie down. She then went to the ventilation shaft alone. Suddenly, a strong rush of methane gas hit her face. If they couldn't think of a way out, they would only end up dying from the poison in the airtight room. At that moment, Sarah unexpectedly noticed the exhaust vent in the floor. The 2 quickly crouched down by the hole, breathing deeply for air. However, this only provided a temporary relief. Meg quickly grabbed some duct tape. Holding her breath, she hurriedly sealed the ventilation shaft. But due to the strong airflow, the tape she had sealed was blown off. Helpless, Meg had no choice but to give up. She then went to the storage cabinet and started rummaging through it. Finally, she found an ignition device. At that moment, a bold idea suddenly came to her mind. She first threw a fireproof blanket to Sarah. Then, she pried open the protective cover of the ventilation shaft. Next, she draped the blanket over herself and placed the ignition device into the ventilation pipe.
Turn the gas off right now.
Frustrated and angry, Junior yelled at the surveillance cameras. At that moment, Sarah unexpectedly noticed that the neighbor across the street was about to go to bed. She quickly grabbed a flashlight. Then, She repeatedly flashed SOS signals. The blinking lights soon caught the neighbor's attention. The neighbor then got up and went to the window to look outside. Finally, they spotted the light in the distance. Seeing this, the mother and daughter felt a glimmer of hope. They used all their strength to shout for help. However, everything went wrong once again. Their hope was shattered once more. At this moment, their spirits sank to an all-time low. After a long time of failing to find a way to escape the safe room, the group's opinions began to diverge, leading to an argument. It was at this moment Meg noticed on the surveillance that the thieves were no longer in the bedroom. She remembered her phone was on the table. Meg knew that if they continued to drag this out, both she and Sarah would certainly meet a terrible end. So, she gathered her courage. While the thieves were still arguing, she quietly opened the door. Then, she ran as fast as she could to the bedroom. But no matter how hard Meg tried, there was no signal in the sealed room. It all seemed to be in vain. However, Meg didn't lose heart. She suddenly remembered she had just failed to connect the phone line. As long as she could find this phone line, she could connect to the main line. So, Meg quickly opened the electrical box. She desperately reached in, trying to grab the phone line inside, but the noise was too loud, instantly drawing the attention of the thieves. Burnham, noticing the landline packaging on the floor, immediately understood Meg's intentions. He quickly pried open the socket on the wall. Fortunately, it was just a false alarm. However, before they could even feel relieved, Meg yanked the phone line inside. She quickly connected the phone lines together. Then, she immediately dialed the emergency number. To her surprise, the call suddenly dropped. In a panic, she quickly dialed her ex-husband David's number, but before she could explain the situation, the phone lost signal again. It turned out that the thieves had used a hammer to cut off the communication. Mother and daughter once again found themselves in despair. But at that moment, Junior in the bedroom suddenly wanted to quit. After being unable to enter the safe room for so long, and with his arms severely burned, he had reached the breaking point. Ignoring Burnham and Raoul's objections, he insisted on turning to leave. This led to a big argument between the three men, but just as he was about to leave, Burnham was stunned, frozen in shock. Raoul stated that someone trying to flee in the middle of the mission should be dealt with on the spot. Witnessing everything, the mother and daughter were instantly terrified, panic-stricken. But what the robbers didn't expect was that the man who had come to check outside the door had just witnessed the scene. Raoul quickly dragged him inside and knocked the man down with a punch. Burnham took out the man's wallet. It turned out that the man was Meg's ex-husband, David. The robbers took advantage of the situation to torment David, hoping to use this as leverage to force Meg to open the door. However, she could only watch helplessly as her ex-husband was tormented. Feeling powerless herself, all she could do was hold Sarah tightly and cry out in agony. Suddenly, Sarah began to convulse, having an asthma attack. If she didn't receive the medication in time, Sarah would soon go into shock and could even die. However, when she looked up at the monitor, she saw Burnham dragging someone downstairs. She thought it was Raoul's body, although she wasn't sure exactly what had happened. Her intuition told her that if she wanted to save Sarah, she had to seize this opportunity. So, she decisively opened the door, but to her surprise, David, covered in wounds, was lying on the bed. There was no time to think. She decided to go help Sarah get her medication first, but what she didn't expect was, she had already fallen into the trap set by the thieves. But little did she know, she had already fallen into the thieves' trap. It turned out that Burnham hadn't dragged Raoul, but her ex-husband, David. By the time Meg realized what had happened, it was already too late. At that moment, Burnham and Raoul had already taken control of the safe room. She quickly avoided the thieves and rushed downstairs. Carefully, she hid behind the door. However, the brutal thieves continued shouting. Meg, gathering all her courage, rushed forward. Meg swiftly picked up the medication and threw it inside. Enraged, Meg kept banging on the heavy door. Her emotions quickly shifted from anger to despair. At that moment, Sarah was in critical condition, but Meg didn't know what to do. Then Meg noticed that Raoul's gun had fallen in the bedroom. She quickly picked up the gun and aimed it at the safe room, but Burnham, through the intercom, told Meg if she didn't put down the gun, they would never open the door. Desperate, Meg told Burnham Sarah's condition was critical. If she didn't get the medication immediately, she would die. Meg anxiously pleaded with Burnham to save her daughter, but there was no reply from Burnham, so Meg frantically kept pounding on the safe room door. Raoul was in unbearable pain. Seeing this, Burnham promised Meg that as long as she went downstairs and waited, he would help inject the life-saving medication into Sarah. For Sarah's safety, Meg had no choice but to take the gun and go downstairs. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Burnham quickly opened the door. He successfully let Raoul pull his hand out. However, Raoul immediately threatened Meg, saying that if she dared to call the police, he would destroy her daughter. Fortunately, Burnham's conscience kicked in. He quickly administered the medication to the girl. Thanks to that, Sarah was able to survive. But just then, the doorbell suddenly rang. It turned out that David had called the police. However, the appearance of the police would only make Sarah more dangerous. Meg quickly put on her clothes and signaled to the thieves to stay calm. She opened the door, pretending to have just woken up. She explained that her husband had mistakenly called the police while drunk. The police, reassured, then left, but continuing like this wasn't going to work. So, an idea began to form in Meg's mind. She placed the gun in David's hand, using the lamp post to prop it up against his leg. Then, Meg picked up a hammer and smashed all the security cameras in the house. Afterward, she hid behind the main door of the hallway. But soon, Raoul discovered her actions. However, at this moment, Burnham didn't care at all. Instead, he calmly rolled up the carpet. Before them appeared a safe. It turned out that their target was the contents of the safe. Burnham quickly set up his professional tools. The safe was finally successfully opened. Inside, there were tens of millions worth of bank bonds. Burnham immediately collected the bonds. After securing the loot, the two quickly opened the door. They grabbed Sarah to use her as leverage against Meg. Then, they quietly made their way downstairs. But what they didn't expect was that David threatened Burnham, telling him to release his daughter, or no one would leave that place. However, Burnham responded that as long as they were allowed to leave, they would release the girl.
Come on. Put that fucking gun down. Just let it go. Let her go.
Burnham seized the opportunity and slipped out through the window. Meg quickly asked Sarah if she was hurt. However, Raoul chased after them. Meg hurriedly told Sarah to hide. It was Burnham. He had long been disgusted by such a monster, so he couldn't bear it and returned. At that moment, the sound of sirens was heard outside. Burnham quickly dropped the gun and ran out. However, a large group of police had already surrounded him. In the end, he was captured by the police on the spot.